this video, I'm going to explore a range of responses to the Section A questions that appeared on the first AQA Specimen English Language Paper 1. The exam paper, which includes the extract, can be downloaded from the address that appears in the description section under the video. I'll also put the extract up on the screen so that you can pause the video and read it without printing it out. For clarity, this is an extract from the novel Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. Please note that these are not exhaustive answers, nor are they exemplars. Rather than there being one correct answer, there are any number of answers which, with justification from the text, are as valid as one another. Presenting an exemplar answer runs the risk of effectively dismissing as wrong other interpretations or ideas that you may have had simply by not considering them. As a consequence, there is much more analysis here than you would ever have time to include under exam conditions. What you will find here, therefore, is a range of observations and analysis which could be said, rather than which should be said, in response to the questions. So to start, here is the extract if you don't already have it printed out. Don't forget to read the introductory section here, as it will help you to put what you are reading into context. Question 1. Read again the first part of the source, lines 1 to 7. List 4 things from this part of the text about the weather in Cornwall. This question is worth 4 marks. This is the warm-up question, and it should be relatively straightforward to get full marks on it, although mistakes can be made if you're not careful. Make sure that you only include information from the section indicated. You will not get any credit for anything outside of it, such as the wind came in gusts, as this appears on line 8. It's a good idea to put some kind of bracket down the margin in order to mark out the section. You can either quote from the text or paraphrase, which just means that you can put it into your own words. Don't copy whole chunks such as, "It was a cold grey day in late November." Even though this does include detail about the weather, i.e. it was cold and grey, it also contains details that are not relevant, i.e. that it was late November. So this is not necessarily providing evidence of your ability to select information. It's also a waste of time. Make sure that you limit your response to the weather. The quotation, "a winter evening," is not about the weather and will not get you any credit. There are, however, more than 4 things to say, which gives you some choice. You could say that it's a cold day, a grey day, that the weather had changed overnight, that there is a wind, or that there is a backing wind. Or if you happen to know what backing means when related to the wind, you can paraphrase by saying that the wind had changed direction. A backing wind is one which has shifted in an anti-clockwise direction. There's a granite or grey sky. There is a mizzling rain, or to paraphrase, a light rain. There is mist on the hills. The air is clammy and the air is cold. All of these are valid points, although if 3 out of the 4 were to relate to the wind, you would only be credited with 1 mark. They have to be 4 different points. So going on to question 2, this question will always ask you to analyse how a writer has used language in a section of the text to achieve a certain effect, and will suggest the kinds of things to look at. Look in detail at this extract from lines 8 to 18 of the source. How does the writer use language here to describe the effects of the weather? You could include the writer's choice of words and phrases. These include nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, and the descriptive phrases which include them. Language features and techniques. These include metaphor, simile, onomatopoeia, polysyndeton, etc. Sentence forms. These include long and short sentences, questions, exclamations, etc. This question is worth 8 marks, and so you should spend about 10 minutes on it. The first thing you should do again is to mark the selected lines on the extract, perhaps using a bracket, so that you don't include any analysis from outside of them. For this question, the section of the extract starts with "the wind came in gusts" and ends with "whatever view there might have been of the countryside was hopelessly obscured." Make sure you read the question carefully so that you fully understand what it is asking you to do. Note that it says that you could include, not that you should include. The AQA guidance states that there isn't always anything meaningful to be said about sentence forms, and you should avoid doing it just for the sake of it. Analysis should always explore how form reflects meaning, and you run the risk of forcing an analysis which will be too general, and you won't get any credit for it. Note also that each of your points of analysis should explicitly refer to the effect of the weather on the landscape and the elements within it, such as the coach, the horses and the passengers. The way that the wind came in gusts suggests that it is both strong and erratic, coming and going with no warning. The adjective exposed and the noun force evoke the idea of vulnerability, danger, and how little control man has over the power of nature. The writer anthropomorphizes the coach, which trembled and swayed, rocking between the high wheels like a drunken man, to make the effects of the weather seem more powerful and ominous. The verbs trembled and swayed evoke a sense of fear and unsteadiness. And the addition of the present participle rocking here gives a sense of build-up as the movement of the coach seems to be getting more and more intense as it is battered by the wind. The writer uses a simile like a drunken man to evoke the image of a coach lurching uncontrollably, at risk of falling over, which lends the scene drama. The storm seems to be so powerful that it has the ability to affect an inanimate object as though it is animate, as the wheels of the coach creaked and groaned. The verb groaned here evoking a sense of pain and fear. The weather doesn't only affect the coach, but the horses and people too. The storm has completely broken the spirit of the horses as they are bombarded by the wind and rain. The way in which they plodded sullenly suggests a slow, effortful and resentful heaviness in their tread. They are completely fed up and impervious to the efforts of the driver to whip them on. The rain is both constant, this adjective evoking the way in which it is relentless, allowing those out in it no respite, and driving, this adjective evoking the sheer force behind it. The effect of the rain on the coach windows is that the view of the countryside through them is hopelessly obscured, and there is a sense of claustrophobia conveyed as it will be impossible for the passengers to see out properly. The writer also uses onomatopoeic sibilant alliteration in the phrase soft spattered mud, the hissing s sound added to the plosive p sound present in spattered, to evoke the sound of the mud as it hits the glass of the coach window. In the case of this extract, there is something worthwhile mentioning about the sentence forms which du Maurier chooses to employ. Her use of a single complex sentence with multiple clauses for each paragraph evokes a relentless sense of movement, carrying the reader, who is barely able to pause for breath, along with it in much the same way as the weather is relentless and the journey seems never-ending. I'm now going to skip to question 4 and come back to question 3 at the end. Question 3 calls for very different skills to those language skills required for both questions 2 and 4, and it's easier to deal with those together. You might also want to consider answering the questions in this order in the exam, and I'll explain why in more detail when we tackle question 3. So question 4 is, focus this part of your answer on the second half of the source from line 18 to the end. A student, having read this section of the text, said, The writer brings the very different characters to life for the reader. It is as if you are inside the coach with them. To what extent do you agree? In your response, you could write about your own impressions of the characters. So, what kind of people are they? Evaluate how the writer has created these impressions. So, how does the writer use language to make you think this, and how well has the writer done this? Support your opinions with quotations from the text. This, of course, should go without saying. So this question is an evaluative question. Not only does it require you to analyse language, as in question 2, but it requires you to give your opinion about how well the writer has achieved their effects. Evaluative words and phrases include ones such as successfully, clearly, vividly, colourfully. The reader is able to picture. The reader is able to visualise. The reader is able to understand how. My first comment after agreeing with the statement that the writer successfully brings these different characters inside the coach to life is going to be an overview. In other words, if I was only allowed 1 or at the most 2 sentences to put the essential points of my answer over, what would I say? I would say that du Maurier creates a collection of characters in the coach whom the reader is able to clearly visualise by focusing on their individual traits and how they react in diverse ways to the stormy conditions and uncomfortable coach journey. I would then go on to talk in detail about how she does this, focusing on each character in turn. She presents the passengers as a unified group at the beginning, as she refers to them collectively using the words together and unison, as they all huddled together for warmth, exclaiming in unison. They appear to be all in this together, cold, damp and unsettled, but the way in which du Maurier describes their different reactions to the coach journey and the weather, however, successfully reveals what a disparate or ununified group they actually are. And this adds interest to the extract. The old man is colourfully described by the writer. He appears pompous and short-tempered as he rose from his seat in a fury to open the window to shout up to the driver. He is a faintly ridiculous character, though. His voice is described as high and petulant, as though he is a sulky child having a tantrum, and all his actions achieve are to make himself and his fellow passengers more uncomfortable by bringing a shower of rain upon them all and thoroughly chilling the interior of the coach. His words are full of hyperbole as he curses the driver for a rogue and murderer, and exclaims that they would all be dead before they reached Bodmin, which helps to communicate that he is not coping with the journey very well at all. He also makes rash claims that he, for one, would never travel by coach again, a pointless and overly dramatic threat, but one which successfully communicates his heightened emotional state. His posturing and puffed-up pomposity are made all the more ridiculous as he gets no reaction at all from the driver, and is forced, after waiting a moment for a reply that never comes, to climb down from his high horse to close the window and return to the corner of the coach, where he muttered in his beard. He is a character whose bark is clearly worse than his bite. By contrast, the old man's nearest neighbour is described as a jovial, red-faced woman, the adjective jovial suggesting that she is good-tempered and jolly, and taking the uncomfortable journey in her stride. Indeed, her reaction to the old man's behaviour is to sigh heavily in sympathy, but then to wink to anyone who might be looking with a jerk of her head towards the old man. She clearly has a very mischievous sense of humour and is making fun of him. Her wink at the other passengers is an attempt to engage them in a private joke at his expense. We realise, however, that her sense of humour is quite a simple one, as she remarked for at least the 20th time that it was the dirtiest night she ever remembered. She appears to have quite a limited repertoire of conversation and is forced to repeat herself over and over. The way in which she brings out a great hunk of cake and plunges into it with strong white teeth vividly portrays her as a larger-than-life character who will not allow the storm to dampen her spirits or put her off her food. The use of indirect rather than direct speech to present what the characters are saying is effective, as not only does it give a flavour of the repetitive nature of their words, but it also communicates to the reader that they are peripheral characters with no narrative importance of their own, beyond adding colour to this description and providing a contrast to Mary Yellen. Du Maurier presents Mary Yellen sitting in the opposite corner of the coach and successfully uses this physical isolation from the rest of the passengers to suggest that she is also emotionally isolated from them. Her silence contrasts with the other characters' outspokenness. Rather than make a fuss or attempt to entertain the other passengers with jokes, she is presented as lost in thought, any cold drip of moisture falling upon her shoulder being brushed away with impatient fingers, as though its presence is a nuisance and a distraction from what she is thinking about. She appears fixated on the little she can see through the window. The writer successfully uses pathetic fallacy to link her hopes and fears with the weather, as she hopes with a sort of desperate interest that the sun will break through the heavy blanket of sky, which she will take as a forerunner or good omen of fortune. The metaphor heavy blanket vividly communicates her sense of being weighed down and stifled by her circumstances, and the reference to forerunner, that she is perhaps superstitious. The reader gets a clear understanding that she is uncertain of what her future holds, and is desperate for any kind of reassurance that there will be a positive outcome to her journey. So now on to question 3. I would recommend that this question, if at all possible, should be tackled after you have done questions 2 and 4. The reason being that the terminology and what you are expected to analyse in this question are completely different. It uses up brain power to switch from one form of analysis to another and then back again, and you also run the risk of lapsing into language rather than structural analysis. Question 3. You now need to think about the whole of the source. This text is from the opening of a novel. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning, how and why the writer changes this focus as the extract develops, any other structural features that interest you. This question is worth 8 marks, which means that you get about 10 minutes to answer it. In my video, which focuses on how to approach this question, I recommend, as per AQA's advice, that you provide an overview of the extract structure before going into detail with specific examples from the beginning, the middle and the end. By overview, I mean a brief description of the whole arc of the piece. The writer demands that we move our focus constantly throughout, as the piece begins with a description of the outside world of the Cornish landscape, which shifts about halfway through to the passengers in the interior of the coach, and then shifts again in the final 2 paragraphs to the internal world of the thoughts and feelings of Mary Yellen. The way in which the writer constantly changes this focus engages us as readers because we are on a journey as much as the people on the coach. What does remain constant, however, is the bad weather, which is omnipresent. It permeates every description in much the same way as the rain soaks through into the coach and affects the passengers to create an atmosphere which is both claustrophobic and unsettling. Du Maurier focuses our attention at the beginning of the extract on a description of the setting. We learn that it is a cold, grey day in late November. The weather is shown to be unsettled as it had changed overnight and has made the day prematurely and unnaturally dark. It's only just after lunchtime, and yet the pallor of a winter evening seems to have closed upon the hills. There's also some indication that the weather is severe enough to threaten the coach with overturning, as the wind came in gusts at times shaking the coach. The negative force of the weather creates a dramatic atmosphere of darkness, turbulence, danger, and uncertainty right from the start. The writer adds to this sense of uncertainty by withholding certain information. She does not, for example, immediately tell us who the passengers are and why they are making this journey to Jamaica Inn in such appalling conditions. The weather remains omnipresent throughout the extract, and we learn in the first paragraph that the cold, clammy air has the power to penetrate the coach, even though all the windows are tightly closed, making the atmosphere chilly and uncomfortable. The writer continues to shift our focus with each new paragraph in the first half of the extract, describing the negative effect of the stormy weather on the coach. The driver, who bent almost double in his seat in a faint endeavour to gain shelter from his own shoulders, and the horses, who are too broken by the wind and rain to feel the whip. A major shift comes about halfway through the extract as du Maurier switches our attention onto the passengers inside the coach. This shift is bridged by the way in which one old fellow opens the window and makes the outside and the inside coincide by bringing a shower of rain upon himself and his fellow passengers. Even though the writer still focuses on the way in which the bad weather affects the passengers, the tone changes in this part of the extract as she describes them with a certain amount of humour. The old man's behaviour as he shouts up at the driver, cursing him in a high petulant voice for a rogue and a murderer, makes him appear slightly ridiculous, while the jovial red-faced woman in the blue cloak makes jokes at his expense and lustily tucks into her huge wedge of cake. The juxtaposition of this light comic relief serves to break the tension and gives the reader a bit of respite after the dramatic description of the storm outside. This somewhat superficial description of the other passengers also keeps us waiting a little bit longer to meet the protagonist, with whom we will make a much more intimate connection, which serves to heighten our curiosity. The extract ends as du Maurier narrows our focus further with the description of Mary Yellen's thoughts and feelings. Not only is this the first time that the narrator's perspective shares a character's viewpoint, as Mary reflects on the weather, but she is also the first character to be named. This interests the reader as we realise that we have finally been introduced to the central character, or the protagonist in the story. She is as transfixed by the weather as her fellow passengers, but her reflections on this and the journey itself are much deeper than theirs. They seem to take on a personal significance, reflecting as they do her inner emotional world. The writer returns to the image of the cloudy, wide granite sky from the beginning of the extract, as Mary hopes with a sort of desperate interest that some ray of light would break through the heavy blanket of sky. The fact that she hopes for a momentary trace of the lost blue heaven that mantled Helford the day before suggests that the journey may not be being made entirely of her own free will, and that she is leaving a happy past behind for a turbulent and uncertain future, as foreshadowed by the stormy weather which looms over her, both literally and metaphorically. We only meet what is to be the novel's protagonist at the end of the extract. We're constantly asking, who is this novel going to be about, as the writer takes us on a journey from the horses to the driver to the different passengers in the coach, until we finally settle on Mary Yellen. The writer structures it in this way to keep us interested, as it leaves us with more questions than it answers. Who is she? What's she left behind? And what's she travelling towards? What is Jamaica Inn, and why is she going there? She's clearly hoping for a better future, but does the tumultuous weather and precarious situation of the coach she is travelling in suggest that this will not come easily, if at all? When we get to the end of the extract, we realise that the journey through the storm is probably a pathetic fallacy, giving us a warning about what the character of Mary Yellen is about to experience in the rest of the narrative. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.